now I am retired. Although in Spanish we say jubilada, not retired, which means that you continue to do work that has meaning and purpose for yourself and the community that you are with. But I'll be more than happy to speak about Esperanza as well. So let me say that this book comes out of a sense of social justice in theological education. And it begins when as I am myself a pastor, and I'm working for continuing education for pastors, Latino pastors in the American Baptist churches. And in that process, conversations with pastors from many contexts. As you know, Latinos are not this monolithic group, but we are very diverse. We belong to a lot of different cultures. We belong to a lot of different subcultures as we come to the United States. And affordability and accessibility was one of the main issues for us at all levels of education, in terms of theological education, all different types of theological education, affordability and accessibility. So to do that a la Latina means to recognize that that's not only about professional ministers, that in a sense, the term of professional ministers for us didn't really exist, that it was a sense of calling that really brought us to theological education. And that now included, theological education includes everyone in the church because of the sacerdocio universal, the priesthood of all believers. And we are a community of disciples for Christ wherever we find ourselves. And so even children have a calling, and we help children to begin to find their callings. We didn't separate children from our worship. Instead, we included them in our worship, and that was a way of helping children to find their sense of who they were. You began to get to know the kids in Sunday school and to know, this kid, what is it that this child is most interested in? What do they seem to be about, etc. So of course, they very quickly knew I was going to be a preacher because I talked too much. And I like to repeat the stories that I was learning, and I would repeat them to younger children, especially my sister, the poor child, and to my dolls or her dolls. I didn't like dolls, they were her dolls, and I would sort of, talk to them and so forth. So I was being mentored, and that's how theological education really begins for us in the churches, that you mentor. You begin to mentor the children, which means that you have them doing things with you. And I remember the first time that I went with my grandfather to prepare communion. He was a deacon. And my grandfather, I had to get up early to get to church real early. And, Saturday night, he began to talk to me about what I was going to do. And then when we got to the kitchen, he had the bread, he had the wine, he had everything that we needed. He explained what everything was. And then we began with this very important ritual of washing your hands so that you could touch what other people were going to be eating. And it was a special prayer of dedicating yourself and dedicating these elements to God. And he did it in a way that it included language that I, as a child, would be able to use and understand. And that moment of washing your hands and the way he did it just sort of brought God's presence into that moment for both him and for me. He wasn't just my grandfather now. He was another minister in the church teaching me about something very, very special that had to do with God. And so this is where theological education begins in the Latina community, okay? So when we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about a sense of calling and how it is that we create ways for children to understand what that means and to play with that, because as children we play with that, but understand that play doesn't mean that it's nonsense. Play means that it's very serious, that it's how we learn what our work in the world is going to be with God. And then, of course, youth, and especially in the Latina church, second-generation youth were very important to me. I was second generation, and not all first-generation pastors knew how to include second-generation youth. And so that became extremely important to me, paying attention to the youth. And then lay discipleship. We always had different workshops and so forth to help laypersons to come into their ministries. Remember, in the Latina community, there aren't always chaplains. And so we're the ones who will visit hospitals. We're the ones who are going to visit prisons. We're the ones who are going to visit people that we understand have special needs in our communities and so forth. And teaching laypersons how to come into those ministries is also important, and how to take care of themselves as well. So theological education then institutionally was about theological education as part of an ecology of education. And that meant that a Bible Institute could do GED, could do English as a second language, could do citizenship classes, could do financial literacy, as well as the usual theological training. And the theological training, of course, was open to all of those different ministries that I have been speaking about. And it parts from understanding what is church. Church as a community of disciples, church as a priesthood of all believers. And that means that what we had to do, and the reason why I wrote the first chapter of this book, is that I needed to unravel the missionary inherited theologies that we had, which had created dichotomies that really in practice didn't exist for us, although they were articulated as such when we did theological training. But when we got into the church, we sort of did differently than what we supposedly articulated in theology. So that was an interesting piece, right? And the reason why you didn't just go against this or confront it is because the missionaries were part of a community. They had sacrificed to be with us and so forth. And you don't go against an authority figure, because authority is built not because you have power, right? Authority is relational. Power is positional. Authority is relational. And we had relationships, and in relationships, you honor one another. So how it is that you are going to speak to someone and to say that you want to expand something is not the way that you would do it in Anglo culture, is to sort of, get up there and undo what someone has just said. That's very dishonoring, especially when you're in a relationship. So I needed to write this chapter to explain some of what was taking place and why it was taking place, because there was nothing malicious about it. There were real reasons about it. And then there were very human pieces to that, the humanity of wanting to be in control. And missionaries had been in control and wanted to have control. And until 1975 in the Episcopal Church, they continued to have that control. And so in different countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, there were different ways of doing the passing of the baton and so forth. And it was important to do that. And therefore, that makes room, theological room then, for us to expand how we think theologically about what is a church and what is the church's mission. And so Misión Integral becomes an important part of that conversation, right? A very important part, because now it really expands what we understand as salvation. It's not this individualistic piece, but because, of course, the mission of the church for many is so you have to preach salvation. But now it's much more. And it allows us to take what we've been doing as a church, the praxis of the church, and to begin to do our own theology from the place of praxis, which is what Orlando Costas left us in his legacy. Orlando Costas was a theologian of in the American Baptist churches as well as the UCC. And Orlando really spoke about how the mission of the church is how the church does theology. And that theology really starts there. And the mission of the church, of course, with her praxis. And so those are the pieces. So we start with those histories and so forth. Then in the next chapters, it's important to talk about what really works in a classroom. How, if you change the theology, you change the andragogy. You naturally do. Because if theology is something that is to be transmitted, then you teach by having rows of people and everybody looks at the backs of everybody else's head, and you don't have a whole lot of conversation. You have the sage on the stage. But if theology and the sense of praxis is this wider conversation, then we have to have other ways of doing this. And of course, in the Latina community, we have the first and the second generational pieces. And Aaron, you need to let me know when I have 5 minutes left, because I have no sense of Anglo time. I have to just tell you that.
You are rolling, and I am loving this. If you're paying attention to the chat, this is feeding us. Please, this is great.
Okay, so where was I? Oh, the pedagogical pieces. So that means that when you're teaching intergenerationally, and when you're teaching with a sense of theological education for everyone and not just for a particular group, now what your classroom looks like is different. And the goals that you have are different. They're not goals for the privilege of a degree. Not when you're teaching for the church. Yes, you'll get that degree and so forth, and you want to bring excellence to that, right? But that's not the dual and in theological education. It's so that you can have this conversation of this community of disciples. Because eventually, it's that community of disciples and the strength of that community of disciples that as they become strong enough, they can now move into a larger understanding of mission and be capable of doing that. It's capacity building that you're doing, in a sense, right? So that then you can become a social movement. And when you become a social movement, now you really are expanding theological education, because you are expanding those that you must be in conversation with and the skills that you need for doing that type of ministry, right? So now, as a pastor, I really need to know how to be a community organizer, for example. I can't just stay in the church. I have to learn to be a community organizer. And many of the pastors have already been doing that, right? And I have to have persons in my church who continue to be my social workers. And now I need people in the church who are my entrepreneurs, because we have to deal with the economic pieces in the community, and so on and so forth. So now, theological education as an independent seminary finds that it must collaborate, and it must create this larger educational ecology. And collaboration is extremely important today. Yeah? So my work at Esperanza was started as a work of an ABC pastor who started working with the pastors in the community. And Orlando Costas was the mentor. And Orlando Costas was about, how is it that we're going to transform the community? And as the pastors began to talk about what was important to them and how they were going to be able to do that, out of that work then came Esperanza, Inc., which today does immigration work, which does the arts, which does housing, which does education writ large from K through college and so forth. And the collaboration was needed with a university. And of course, ABC, we're in the state of Pennsylvania, they're in Philadelphia. Eastern University is not too far away, about 45 minutes away, sometimes a little more if you get stuck in that traffic. But a conversation was started. But that conversation took a while, because collaboration is not usually what we're about as institutions. And because this was going to be a non-traditional program. So you have to think in the new things of the Spirit for chapter 5, non-traditional. when you think about the institutional pieces that I'm speaking about in chapter 4, once again, collaboration and hybrid institutions. So how is it that institutions can overlap in doing a work together, continue to have their identities when it comes to doing the other stuff on the side that doesn't involve the work that they have in common, but they can be, instead of doing this, for a season or what have you, they decide that as an institutions, through separate institutions, they're going to connect that part of their work, and it's going to continue to happen together. And they create the policies, and they work with their with the different stakeholders to make sure that that happens. And then, as we know, we have to have people who will champion the cause beyond our own lifetime. And that's important, to create people who are going to do that, so that you don't run into this, Pharaoh who did not know Joseph syndrome, right? So those are important pieces. So those are some of the structural pieces of chapter 4, and then chapter 5 continues to talk about new things. And in the new things, we go back to lifelong learning, because in the new things, we're talking about new skills, reflections of the meanings of these things in our times, but those new skills also mean, what does this mean for my life? My life is changing. So it's not just about new skills for learning, for doing, but my life is changing. And especially after the pandemic, we realized how important it is to pay attention to our lives, that our lives are this living institution that's doing this work. And then I would say that as that's happening across the lifespan of an organization also needs to ask about lifelong learning. What is the organization, what is the institution learning about its life in these changing times? And how do I become a person who can have those conversations? So Esperanza College then is about educating in the urban area. This is a suburban university, and we had a lot of conversations that we needed to have, a lot of conversations about how we were going to deal with curriculum, about how we were going to deal with the social injustices of education in an urban poor environment. How are we going to make up for those pieces? How was this not going to lower the standards of the university? How are we going to, what did excellence mean? And I explained to them that it's not about having excellent students, but about how you educate excellently. So now the burden is not on the student, but the burden is on the teacher. If you can teach anybody. If you can't teach, then you need students who can teach themselves. And that's what research universities are working with. So changing the meanings of things and changing cultures and bringing people in who can sort of understand that is what Esperanza College has been about. And it's about the transformation of lives. If you want to see miracles happen, then you work with real people in those urban environments. 80% of the students of Philadelphia go through trauma. And 1 out of every 4 persons in the city of Philadelphia is a supervised citizen, which means that they're under the parole system, right? So that tells you a little bit about the students that we were working with, persons who wanted to change their lives. And they came to know Jesus through worship. Not because we were worshiping, but there was a group that was worshiping. They weren't just singing. They weren't musicians. I don't just do musicians in a church. I need people who can worship God, who really, really love God. And I put them in a corner where everyone was going to go back and forth, and they would sit down and listen to this. And as they did, the Spirit of God was moving because they were worshiping. And when I came and stood in front of them, they were all crying, and they said, "We need you to tell us what this is all about." And I would say, "Oh, this is the love of God." And they would say, "Can we have more of that? Can you tell us more?" And then we would have a real conversation. And I knew enough about their lives to be able to bring it to their lives. And then we would have a community meal. And we continued to talk about it. And the professors were there and everybody was there, and you could continue to have conversation. And That's how they came to know God, in a Christian organization. It wasn't about bringing these really smart kids who already had it all done, who already knew God, into the standards of what it is to be a Christian university. We changed that. We worked with who we had in front of us, and we loved people. And the one-on-one conversations that I had, I cannot begin to tell you. So let me leave it there. I know I went past 10 minutes, but let me leave it there so that you can ask questions and so forth.
Friends, thank you so much. I mean, Dr. Conde-Frazier, what a blessing and a gift you've given us. You really. And then I went to church. Here we are. This is great. So I know we've got a number of questions. I want to queue up one because I think I really, really loved how you talk about educational or the educational ecology and positioning theological education as an institutionally within a broader ecology. Thinking about it in terms of social movements and the practices of community organizing. Wonderful. Let me stop recording here just to make sure.